his writings in the Wall Street Journal and other publications around the country. You may have seen him also on the standard news channels as a talking head. A nice talking head, but a talking head nonetheless. And he's been doing a lot of work in healthcare reform. His latest work effort is in the back. It's called Bad Medicine. We just reloaded all those tables back there with all of the stuff that we want you to take away from you. So please help me in welcoming Mike Tanner.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your having me back out to Montana and showing me some of this wonderful Montana weather. I actually have to say I'm amazed there's so many of you here. You realize in Washington, if we'd had this much snow, it would be a national emergency. They'd have closed the city down, called in the National Guard. The president would have flown off to a secret bunker someplace. Can you send some our way, please? So, at any rate, here to talk to you a little bit about the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which passed last March. I'll tell you a little bit about it. Have to do this, of course, because you recall that just before the vote, Nancy Pelosi told us that they had to hurry up and pass the bill so that we could find out what was in it. We later learned that didn't really matter because your Senator Max Baucus didn't bother to read it even after it passed. But I did. I have to say, so I am going to talk to you a little bit about what's in it. The bill itself is, of course, 2,409 pages long, about 477,520 words, or as I like to think about it, $1.2 million per word. That, of course, was not enough for Washington. I mean, how can you possibly restructure the healthcare system in merely 2,400 pages? So they then, of course, had to pass the reconciliation bill, which was another 153 pages or 34,000 words. So all told, we're up over a little over 2,550 pages and about 500,000 words of healthcare reform. The result of which is this is now our healthcare system. Now, I have to say, in fairness, this actually is a partisan document. It was prepared by the Republican staff of the Joint Economic Committee. So it's probably not the fairest representation of the healthcare system. And those of you who know the CATO Institute know that we are rigorously nonpartisan. So we put together our own chart of the healthcare system. And it's clearly much simpler than we thought. Actually, you should note that especially these beige boxes on here are part of the new 99 healthcare positions that are created, agencies, commissions, and departments that are created as a result of this bill. Actually, I say there's 99. That's the minimum number. The General Accounting Office, or Government Accounting Office now it's called, put out a report a couple of weeks ago in which they said that they were unable to determine how many new agencies, commissions, and positions this created because so many of the agencies and commissions were granted the power to create additional agencies and commissions if they wanted to, that they could not actually predict how many there would ultimately be. But we've actually identified some 99 of them in addition to other agencies and commissions and positions being given additional powers and authority and oversight that they didn't have before, and that's all reflected in this chart. So you can see that it's obviously going to be very simple for the average patient now to navigate the healthcare system. There's not going to be any bureaucracy for us to worry about. But I'm going to try to simplify it even further if I can and sort of walk you through some of the key parts of what is in the Healthcare Act. The first, and the one that's gotten perhaps the most debate, is this individual mandate. That is this requirement that every person must have health insurance. If you do not get health insurance at work or through a government program, Medicaid or Medicare, then you must purchase health insurance on your own. And if you fail to do so, you will be fined. That fine in 2014 is 1% of your adjusted gross income. In 2015, it's 2% of your AGI, and in from 2016 on, it will be 2.5% of your adjusted gross income. Now, you may think that this really doesn't affect you because you already have health insurance. And so, therefore, this is only about people who don't have insurance, so it's not going to bother you. Well, the question, of course, is what happens, if you're going to say that people have to buy health insurance, you have to define what is health insurance. I don't know, I'm pretty sure that my policy with the $1 million deductible that I got for $12.95 down at Albertsons probably isn't going to qualify. And in fact, the legislation does specify at great length what insurance has to be in order to meet this particular individual mandate. That it cannot have deductibles over a certain level. It can't have co-payments applied to certain types of procedures. It can't have deductibles applied to those procedures. It can't have lifetime caps. It can't have yearly limits. And then if those sorts of things weren't enough, there's also a whole list of benefits that it must include. For example, it must now include mental health benefits at parity. It must include drug and alcohol rehabilitation therapy. It must include prescription drug coverage, which is why the prescription drug industry spent $150 million advertising in favor of this bill during the debate. It must include include vision care and dental care for children. And it goes on and on and on. And if that's not enough, the bill also gives the Secretary of HHS the power to develop any new benefits that they think should be included in every insurance plan in America. So what happens then if you have health insurance today and it doesn't meet all of these new requirements that the government now says insurance has to meet? Well, I actually have some good news, because the final version of the bill, unlike previous versions, and some of you heard me talk about this before, knew the previous versions had a requirement that said you had to switch. Well, the final version of the bill says that no, you don't. You are grandfathered in with your current insurance. Unless you make any change whatsoever to your current insurance plan. As soon as you make any change to that plan, then you must go and meet all the government's requirements. In addition to that, the plan, you can keep your current insurance plan, as I said, but that plan is not allowed to sign up anyone new for that plan. So what's naturally going to happen over time is, as people leave the plan's pool is going to get smaller and smaller. It's going to become economically unviable, and eventually that plan is going to go away, at which point you will then have to meet the government's mandates in terms of what is insurance, even if that new insurance has benefits you don't want, or benefits that you're morally opposed to, or it costs a lot more money. You will have to meet the government's requirements at that point. You will not be able to keep the current insurance you have, even if you like it, despite what we were told during the debate. The second part of this is an employer mandate. This is a requirement that every business with more than 50 employees must provide health insurance to their workers and pay at least 85% of the cost of an individual policy, 65% of the cost of a family policy, or they will be fined. Now, the actual formula for the fine is a little bit complex, but it's between $2,000 and $3,000 per worker in terms of the fine. Now, this is a little bit different than the individual mandate, because once again, they've had to define what insurance is. If you don't meet all those government requirements and the insurance you provide to your employers, you're not meeting the mandate. And unlike the individual plans, employer plans are not grandfathered. That is, if you have you're offering health insurance to your employees and it doesn't meet the government's requirements, you must change your plan in order to come into compliance with the new set of mandates and rules for insurance, unless you get a waiver. And so far, they've given out slightly over 100 waivers. to various groups. Some were large employers like McDonald's. Some were favored interests like the teachers' unions that got special waivers from these mandates. But other businesses are applying fairly regularly. These are one-year waivers, by the way. That means that next year people won't have to change, but we'll have to see how it goes in the future, whether these waivers continue to be granted down the road. Third, there's a host of new insurance regulations, some of which have already taken effect. Some of them are going to actually be popular, although I think people don't realize what's in them. For example, there is now a rule that says you can keep your children on your policy until they reach age 26. It's the slacker mandate. A lot of parents I talked to were very positive on this originally. They said, well, this is great. They thought it was free. Then they found out that it was actually going to cost about $3,400 per child per year to keep your child on that policy. And employers were very quick to say, hey, we ain't picking up that cost. So the parents were getting stuck with the whole bill for that. It's not quite as popular as it once was. There's also a new requirement that says that children with pre-existing conditions can no longer be denied health insurance. The first result of that was insurers who offered child-only policies stopped offering them because they knew that that would be gamed. And then there's the cap on lifetime limits. You can't have a cap on lifetime limits or annual limits in terms of insurance policies. That's also gone into effect as of September. But the other two that are coming into effect are of a little more concern. One of these is what's called guaranteed issue, and that basically means that insurance companies cannot turn away anybody with a pre-existing condition. This will go into effect in 2014. Now, when we talk about pre-existing condition, what we're really talking about is people who are already sick. So it's a little bit like saying you could drive your car into a tree and then pick up the phone and say, hey, Geico, you know, I've been meaning to buy that auto insurance. Now seems like a good time. But that's sort of the rule. And then the second part of that goes with that, because if you say they got to sell you insurance, even if somebody walks in the door and says, I've got stage 4 cancer, you've got to sell me insurance, and insurance companies have to do that, you also have to limit how much they can charge people for that insurance. Because you say, well, you got to sell it to them, but they can charge you $1 million a month premium, well, it's not going to do much good. So they have this thing called community rating. And what community rating does is it says everybody must pay the same premium for health insurance regardless of how healthy you are. Under this law, you're allowed to make a slight variation on the basis of age. You can charge a little bit more to someone who's 64 than you can to someone who's 18. And you can make a variation on the basis of smoking. You can charge 1.5 times as much to a smoker as a non-smoker. That's it. You can't make any other variations in terms, well, there's a geographic variation. A big city can charge a little more than a small town, but that's it. You can't charge on the basis of health. Now, this is good news if you're old and sick. Your premiums are coming down. So if you're older and sicker out there, bill's going to benefit you. If you're young and healthy, your premiums are going up. And they're going up a lot to offset those things coming down. So basically, you're young, you're healthy, you're screwed. Fourth, there's going to be something called insurance exchanges. Your state will have to set one up. If it fails to set one up, the federal government will set it up for you. You can set up more than one if you want, but you have to set up at least one in your state. And I've really struggled at trying to explain what an insurance exchange is, because it just goes beyond my ability to comprehend. In all honesty, look, I go around the country and I make a living partially by making fun of Congress. Sometimes I really underestimate their brilliance. And I want you to just try to think of something like this exchange. They've created a place where buyers and sellers can come together.
In his
And the buyers will have money, and the sellers will have a product. And they're going to exchange the money for the product. Can you imagine that? How? How have we gotten by without Congress? Now, in fairness, it actually is a little more complex than that. It's going to be like a giant e-insurance where you can go online and look at all the plans. They're going to require that every plan become a platinum, gold, bronze, silver plan, so you can compare them all together and based on actuarial value. But essentially, it's doing what every marketplace in America already does, except this way Congress can take credit for it. And then finally, there's going to be a host of new subsidies and an expansion of Medicaid under this bill. A very large expansion of Medicaid is going to be partially paid for by your state. I've looked at it this morning, and basically in the first 10 years, by which I mean the first 3 years, because basically the federal government picks up the costs over the first few years and then goes away, like most bait and switch programs the federal government does. But you will ultimately end up having to pay about $21 million in additional Medicaid costs by your state out of this bill. That's about 1% of your general budget of your general fund in additional Medicaid spending as a result of this bill, and it will go up considerably after that. That's just in the initial period, so it'll rise considerably. You are, I believe, the 12th worst state in terms of being hit under this bill. Just something to be aware of on that. And then the subsidies, very complex system of refundable tax credits. There's two different refundable tax credits. One applies to insurance premiums and one applies to the deductibles under those insurance premiums. If you can afford a tax accountant to be able to figure out if you get the credit, you probably don't need the subsidy. But there is a formula that allows people basically earning as much as $88,000 for a family of four to qualify for some partial subsidy under this bill. So that's it. So that's sort of the key elements, if you will, of the new health care law. And let me just kind of try and talk you through a little bit of what is accomplished as a result of that. The big question, of course, was universal coverage. If you recall, the debate was all driven by the fact that they said we had 50 million Americans who are uninsured as a result of this bill, or they're going to reduce that. People have heard me speak before know that I don't put much faith in that 50 million number, but for the sake of argument, let's accept their way of doing it. Under their methodology, they do reduce the number of uninsured from 50 million to about 23 million uninsured people. Now that's some progress, but it's hardly universal coverage. It still have about 23 million people, by their way of measuring, who are uninsured as a result of this. And in fact, if you look at what's happening, you get a fairly big drop. It does bottom out at about 21 million uninsured, and then it starts back up again. So you start seeing a slight growth in the number of uninsured by 2019, and that growth continues thereafter as well. So you begin to see it rising back up again. So it's not a whole lot of bang for the buck. I would also just point out that in this drop area where the number of uninsured drops, you might think those are people getting health insurance. Well, as I mentioned, about half of them are actually just going into the Medicaid program. They're not actually getting private health insurance. About half of all the newly insured are simply being put in the Medicaid program. We know how difficult what that means in terms of access to care. About a third of all physicians don't accept Medicaid patients right now. So simply putting them in the Medicaid program doesn't mean they're going to have any better access to care. It also creates a problem for the rest of us. We know, for example, that the number one users of hospital emergency rooms are actually people on Medicaid. That lack of primary care physicians, because doctors won't take Medicaid patients because of other problems the Medicaid populations have, they show up in the emergency rooms for treatment. Well, you add 20 million new Medicaid patients to the rolls and do nothing to expand emergency room availability, and what you're talking about is flooding emergency rooms. And I've talked to a number of trauma physicians and the associations that deal with this sort of thing, and they are very seriously worried about their emergency rooms just being overwhelmed. So you might want to look at your local hospital emergency rooms and what it could mean to them if you essentially have a 25 or 30% increase in utilization at that emergency room, which is very likely under this bill. Can you keep your current insurance? Short answer is probably not. I already talked you through the mandates, both the individual and employer mandate. By the way, on the employer mandate, there was a memo that leaked from the Department of HHS that indicated that about 2/3 of all businesses and 80% of small businesses will have to swap their current insurance for a plan that meets the government's requirements ultimately under this. If you have a flexible spending account, beginning next year, your amount you can contribute to it is cut in half. You used to be able to contribute $5,000 to a flexible spending account. That's cut to $2,500 beginning next year. You also can no longer use FSAs for over-the-counter medications, and there's some other restrictions on them as well that are put in place. If you have a health savings account, we don't know what their fate's going to be. There's about 10 million Americans with health savings accounts. There's a big question. A health savings account has to be tied to a high-deductible insurance plan. In the bill, there's a new medical loss ratio requirement that says basically that insurers' plans must pay out 80%, at least 80% of their premiums and benefits. With these high-deductible plans, they're not set up to work that way. Some of that money goes into the health savings account. Some of it's paid out of the health savings account towards the plans or towards the cost of treatment. We're waiting a ruling from Secretary Sebelius on whether or not contributions to the HSAs or the payouts from the HSAs count against this medical loss ratio. If the decision is no, they don't, almost all existing high-deductible insurance policies will be prohibited. And as a result, you will no longer be able to contribute to your health savings account under this law. And then finally, Medicare Advantage. This law begins to changes essentially the formula for the way Medicare Advantage is paid for by the federal government. It does so in a way that severely cuts the payments to the insurance companies. The insurance companies have already come back and said that if that happens, they will either raise premiums for seniors or they will stop offering the plans. We know already Harvard Pilgrim in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine has dropped its participation in the Medicare Advantage program as a result of this. Others are going to do the same. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Studies estimates that about 25 to 50% of all seniors will lose their Medicare Advantage coverage and have to go back into traditional Medicare as a result of this. So that's something to look at. By the way, while I'm on Medicare, I'll also mention that the CMS has estimated that as a result of the cutbacks in this bill, about 15% of all hospitals will close. And particularly hard hit will be rural areas and inner cities because of the reimbursement cutbacks under this bill. And that's from CMS. So something else to bear in mind. How much is it all going to cost? Well, you may have remembered during the debate we heard an awful lot about bending the curve. You know, there was going to be this whole thing that we had to bend the cost curve on health care because, look, we're spending a lot of money in this country on health care, and it's getting very expensive. Well, the fact is this health care bill does bend the health care curve upward. The two lines here, the dotted line is current health care spending if we had done nothing. You can see it's shooting up if we did nothing. The solid line is having passed the health care law. It is now shooting up even faster. So all we've managed to do is make health care cost more. As for the bill itself, you know, do you remember, there was a moment just before the bill passed, and virtually all the leadership in Congress came out, and they were on the steps of the Capitol. They were busy dislocating their shoulders, patting themselves on the back, because they got the cost of this bill down to $950 billion. Now, of course, I remember when $950 billion was actually a lot of money. You know, now I know it's a rounding error in the latest bailout. But it's not even close to the actual cost of this bill. You know, for one thing they did in this bill was, this is a fun little accounting gimmick. And I'll tell you, I truly like the Congressional Budget Office. I think they're nonpartisan. I think they do a terrific job. But they operate within the four corners of the rules that they're given. And one of those is that they produce a 10-year budget forecast. So when they do that, they start this year, 2010, they go to 2019, and they say, how much will this bill cost over those 10 years? And they came up to $950 billion. Except that the bill doesn't spend any money until 2014. So you've only got 6 years of spending stretched over 10 years, and it sounds pretty good. Just think if you could drop out a week every month of your household budget, how much better off you'd be. Well, we said, what happens if you actually had 10 years of spending? So we started in 2014 when the bill started spending money, and we went to 2023 and continued at the same rate of spending. And it turns out it's not $950 billion, but about $1.8 trillion, almost double over that period of time. And they did a few other things in there as well. They dropped a few items from the cost. For example, the Congressional Budget Office in a separate report said this bill will cost about $105 billion to implement. These were costs that were authorized but not appropriated. And because they weren't appropriated, they didn't go into the cost of the bill, but they're going to have to spend the money. For example, they've got to hire approximately 13,500 new IRS agents to enforce the individual mandate. The cost of paying their salaries is not included in the bill. The cost of setting up the exchanges is not included in the bill. Those sorts of things are going to have to be funded, maybe, by the new Congress. But we said, let's take that $105 billion and add it back in, since it's its actual cost. And then, of course, you may have heard about the so-called doc fix. Now, this is the fact that in coming to that $950 billion estimate for cost, they assumed that next year Congress was going to cut Medicare by 23%. Now, in fairness, that actually is what the current law says. If Congress did nothing, Medicare would automatically be cut by 23%. And that has been the law since 2001. And every year, Congress, not being suicidal, says, we're not going to do that, and they postpone that 23% cut. But in coming to $950 billion, they assumed that for the first time in history, next year, Congress would really do it and make a 23% cut in Medicare. And then, not to say that anyone in Washington is cynical, but even as they were making that assumption, they introduced a separate bill repealing the 23% cut. And when asked about that, they said, oh, but that's a whole separate bill. That doesn't count in our bill. That's a different bill over here. Again, think of how much better off your budget would be if your mortgage was a whole separate bill, didn't count. That's what they're doing. Now, that's going to cost $350 billion over the first 10 years, more after that. We said, let's add that back in. And when you do it all and put it all back in, over 10 years of cost, the bill actually costs not $950 billion, but $2.7 trillion. And it doesn't save $150 billion or so on the budget deficit, which they claim it adds about $350 billion to the national debt over that period of time. And I just want to throw this chart in just so you can see this in context. This is current government spending. The little green thing is up on top. Even without that, by 2050, if we don't add another government program ever, the federal government will consume 43% of GDP. Think about that. 43 cents out of every dollar produced in this country will be consumed by the federal government. And state and local governments take another 15 to 20% of GDP. So you're talking about over 60%. Over 60 cents of every dollar produced in this country would be consumed by the government. No economy can possibly survive that level of government spending. And our answer to that was to tack the light green line on top of it all. So, just to keep that in context, they paid for a lot of this with new taxes. There's a number of these taxes you may not have to care too much about. For example, the black liquor tax only matters if you're a paper mill in Wisconsin. But most of these others you're going to have to deal with. There is a new surtax on investment income, over $250,000 a year. There's a 0.9% Medicaid or Medicare tax that's tacked on now to interest. Capital gains, including capital gains, just generous exemptions and all that, but it'll fall on some real estate transactions. There's other. The Medicare payroll tax hike, as I said, is extended to 0.9%. I'm sorry, the surtax is actually 3.5%. It's the Medicare payroll tax after the Medicare pay tax has risen. That's tacked on as the interest and capital gains. There's a tax on a number of medical companies, prescription drugs, insurers, medical device manufacturers. People think of medical devices as being big things, X-ray machines and so on. Surgical gloves are a medical device. Scissors, a condom are all medical devices. Get hit with a new 2.5% tax. The floor for medical itemized deductions is raised. Right now you could deduct medical expenses if it hits over 7.5% of your income. That's being raised to 10% before you can deduct that. There is a tax on tanning beds that's already gone into effect. I was shocked that it took place because we all know Snooki actually went to Washington to campaign against that. It's true. She had a big meeting with John McCain, but didn't succeed. So there's a number of these taxes that are in there. The 1099 reporting requirement, small businesses, anytime you do business over the course of a year with any supplier in excess of $600, you must now file a 1099 for that. You must file one with the supplier and with the IRS, which means you have to have the supplier's tax ID number. And by any supplier, it means if you have a company car or a car you claim as a business expense and you get gas, and you buy $600 worth of gas from the same gas station over the course of the year, you must now file a 1099 with them. So you better be keeping track of exactly where you buy your gas during the course of the year. And of course, you got to stop in and get their IRS number and all those sorts of things while you're doing it. So a number of things that are going to be there. What about your insurance premiums? Well, if you recall, leading up to the debate, the president gave some very scary numbers, and I have to say, he was absolutely right about this, and they were very scary. He said, if we do not pass this bill, health insurance premiums are going to double in the next 6 to 10 years. Now, having passed this bill, the Congressional Budget Office looked at it and now says that having passed this bill, health insurance premiums will double in the next 6 to 10 years. Now, that's across the board. There are exceptions. For example, if you work for a big business, if you're in a big company, you could see from that doubling baseline, we're starting with the baseline is doubling, you could see about a 3% decline in your premiums for the big business from that doubling. If you're in a small business, nothing much different. It's going to double. That's about what it is. If you buy a policy on your own, if you get individual health insurance, your premiums are going to go up about 13% more than if we had done nothing at all. So start with that doubling, and then it's going to go up about 13% above that. And then finally, if you're young and healthy, well, there's a number of estimates on what could happen to you. They're all over the lot. The best news for you is from the RAND Corporation. They said your premiums are only going to go up about 17% faster than the doubling. The Council for Affordable Health Insurance is at the high end at about 95% increase. Millman puts in the middle somewhere around 30%. But basically, you're back to being screwed. A timeline taking you all through it. While some things have already happened, we know that just before the election, we did mail seniors a check for $250. Why? Because it was just before an election. There's a ban on pre-existing condition for children, no lifetime caps. The high-risk pools were supposed to have been set up. I don't know how you're doing in your state. Most states have not done very well at actually setting them up, so that's a little bit behind schedule. We now have to have restaurants must post calorie counts more conspicuously as a result of this bill. And vending machines must now post the calorie counts for every item in the vending machine. So when you get those cravings for Doritos and you're out there plunking your quarters in, you'll know exactly how many calories you're adding, and I'm sure everybody will turn away as a result of that. The tanning tax is now in effect. Beginning next year, there is a small business tax credit. It is another one of these remarkably complex tax credits, but it does say it'll help pay for insurance for some small businesses. In my paper Bad Medicine, I go through the formula that you can get to get this, but basically assume you have to have about 10 or fewer employees, be paying a huge amount for insurance, and you get about $2,000 to help offset some of that cost. Medicare Advantage cuts will begin next year. It takes 3 years to fully phase them into effect, but you can expect to start to see companies begin to drop them or raise premiums for seniors beginning next year. Medicaid expansion kicks in next year, but your state isn't going to have to pick up the cost until about 2017, after which the federal government goes away. The flexible spending account limits go in next year. 2012, the various tax hikes go into effect. 2014, that's when the key ones come, the big ones, the individual mandate and employer mandate, both go into effect in 2014. The subsidies kick in. The insurance regulations I talked about, community rating, guaranteed issue, they go into effect in 2014. Health savings accounts limits, depending on what the ruling is from the Secretary, would kick into effect in 2014. In 2015, there's a very interesting provision. It's the Independent Medical Payment Advisory Committee. This is actually not a bad idea, but it's, of course, a little bollock stuff. The idea was that, look, Medicare, for all that the Republicans went out and I think rather shamefully campaigned on the idea that, oh my God, the Democrats are cutting Medicare, to which I said, thank God. But Medicare is $50 to $100 trillion in debt. I would hope somebody was trying to cut it. But the reality is, yeah, they cut it and then they just spent the money somewhere else, so they didn't actually do anything about the $50 to $100 trillion in debt. But the idea behind this Independent Medical Payment Advisory Commission is that, look, somewhere in the future, they know Congress doesn't have the courage to actually cut Medicare benefits. So this commission is going to recommend cuts. It's going to operate a little bit like the base closing commission. It'll make recommendations for Medicare cuts, and if Congress doesn't actually overrule them, then those cuts would go into effect automatically. The problem is they then backed away from this and limited to what the commission could actually recommend. They can't recommend anything that would require any senior to pay more money. They can't recommend that any service provided by Medicare be eliminated. Basically, at the end of the day, the only thing they can recommend is that the reimbursement rate to physicians and hospitals be cut. So you can expect more hospitals closing, more doctors refusing to take patients, and so on. And then in 2018, we already know the government's going to fine you if you don't get the health insurance that's generous enough for them. If it's too generous, they're going to tax you beginning in 2014. There's a 40% excise tax on health insurance premiums that are too generous, health insurance plans that are too generous beginning in 2018. So that essentially is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act as we have it. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Is there any, find good help? I'll start at the back and move forward. There's going to be a lot here, and we don't have a lot of time, but we'll get a few anyway.
I've been a healthcare provider for 35 years and an attorney for 20. When are they going to install a Canadian system? Because that's what I see coming. And the private practice of medicine will be outlawed, et cetera. I think do we have to eliminate? Do we have to start completely over? I think we do. Do you agree with that?
Oh, well, yeah, two questions there. The first, or the second part is easy. Yeah, I think it's impossible to make much headway while this bill's in existence. This bill basically prohibits any of the sort of common sense, market-oriented reforms that actually might make the healthcare system better. They're almost all outlawed under this bill, or at least made extremely difficult to do. The second part, whether we're going to end up with a Canadian system, I think that's a debate that's coming very soon, because this system is so impractical, so unworkable, it's going to collapse of its own weight. And then we will have a debate between market and Canadian-style system, and we'll see what happens. But this system, as structured now, is not going to survive for very long. It's just not practical. And I think the left understands that. And they built a lot of things in there that provide the structures they need to build on it down to the way to a Canadian-style system.
Obviously, we need to get rid of this thing. How are we going to do it? I talked to Senator Thune when he was up in the Flathead. Asked him if there was the political will in Washington, D.C. to get rid of this thing, and he hemmed and hawed and had a great response, but it didn't really give me a good answer. 32 states in the union right now are looking at nullification to get rid of it. Should we do the same thing in Montana?
Yes, not that it will help a great deal. The reason ultimately, I think that there's first of all, you're not going to repeal it in the next session of Congress. I know every Republican rugging for dog catcher campaigned on the idea that they're going to repeal the health care bill. But the reality is that as long as the president's got veto power, Democrats control the Senate, what will happen is Republicans will hold a vote in January on repeal. It will pass hugely. Not only will every Republican vote for it, there's still some 25 Democrats who voted no that are still in office, and they'll vote for it, for repeal. So it'll pass the House overwhelmingly, go to the Senate. Harry Reid will never even bring it up for a vote. So you're not going to get repeal. There are things short of that the Republicans can do. At the very modest end of it, you expect them to hold a lot of hearings. They expect Kathleen Sebelius to move into Capitol Hill and spend a lot of time up there testifying. And Donald Berwick, the guy who was knighted for defending the British national health care system, now head of the Medicare system here in this country, he will be up there testifying a lot. In fact, I think he's already going to start tomorrow or the next day with the first testimony. So those sort of things. Second, there's some very unpopular things like that 1099 reporting thing. There's a long-term care program that everyone agrees is insolvent as part of this. Even the Democrats like Kent Conrad have said is a bankrupt. You might be able to start picking those things off one at a time. And then third, you can defund a lot of it. You don't have to fund those 13,500 IRS agents. Congress theoretically can say no one working for the federal government can work on implementing this bill with federal funds. That's only how Congress cut off the Vietnam War. They simply said you can't use any Defense Department money to fight a war. Congress has the power of the purse. So they can do a lot with that. You may see tries on that. Don't know if they have the courage to follow through on it. The big battle is going to be in 2012 when it's going to be fought out in the presidential campaign level. And then finally, you have the lawsuits. You have a number of lawsuits that are pending that are challenging the individual mandate, which is really the key to this, particularly since there's no severability clause in this legislation. So if the individual mandate goes down, almost all of it will go down. Basically, everyone believes this is going to be a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court in about 2 years. And we're basically pitching Justice Kennedy. And Justice Kennedy looks at things like what is the public mood, and if 25 or 30 states have passed these nullification laws, that tells him where the public is. So I think there's a value in passing it, even though the reality is the federal law trumps there's a supremacy clause, and essentially federal law would trump it.
In terms of the overall aspect of the bill, there's an unfunded mandate that's also set up going to the states in terms of the administration. Since there's a lot of legislators in here, what kind of a cost basis can you guesstimate, say even just for Montana, regarding the implementation of that, and what kind of a bureaucracy we're going to have to set up and pay for out of Montana money?
Right. Well, we know under the Medicaid it's going to cost you about $21 million, they say, over those last couple of years.
That's just for the Medicaid.
That's just for the Medicaid. You can refuse to set up the exchange. The federal government would then set it up and actually, I believe, have to pay for it at that point because they can't actually conscript you into running it. But because there's a case, New York v. U.S., that basically, and there's another one about sheriffs, but that essentially says they can't conscript you. They can bribe you and they can punish you, but they can't make you pass legislation. Even on the Medicaid front, look to Texas right now, which is talking about withdrawing from the Medicaid system. It's not mandatory that states participate in Medicaid. You'd lose your federal matching funds, but then you would no longer have to meet any federal requirements for eligibility or anything else. You could have it be whatever you want it to be in terms of a program or not have one. There's no requirement that states participate. Texas is serious, and a number of other states. In fact, I believe ALEC may have some model legislation on this, or we're working on this in terms of withdrawal from the Medicaid system. A number of states are looking at that, and I would consider that, again, it's probably a game of chicken, but it might be enough to make the federal government blink if enough states begin to look at something like that on that.
Okay, last question. Feel free to accost Michael after this and ask him your questions. We've also got lots of copies of Bad Medicine in the back that you can grab as well.
It looks to me as though the smart economic decision for virtually every employer would be to drop group health insurance as a consequence of this. And so that's likely to happen. So let me ask you a question. Do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing?
A mixed blessing. It is very likely to happen. I mean, you have a player pay system in which it's a lot cheaper to pay than to play. And you've already had a number of large businesses, AT&T, Verizon, among others, 3M, Caterpillar, exploring the idea of whether or not they want to drop their employees from it. If they do, the employees would then be eligible to participate in the exchange. The federal government would come in and subsidize them. It's got a potential of moving in the direction which we would like to see of an individual marketplace. It also has a potential of having the government simply say, well, now we have to set up a system, a public option to deal with all these people who are in the marketplace. So I think what it does is set up the secondary debate about which direction you go in that. Ultimately, I think the employer-based system is not viable. I mean, it's not, in the long term, is simply not going to continue. And we're going to get, back to that question earlier. This preempted the debate we really should have. I always tell my friends on the left who talk about single-payer systems that I understand the single-payer system. I really do. I don't agree with it. But, I can see, you go in here, you come out here. I know how all the bells and whistles work in between. Market-based system, same thing. This, I haven't a clue how this is supposed to work. In the end, I think we're going to have a debate between these two. And hopefully we'll win that one. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, a couple of quick administrative notes. Lunch is going to be served out there shortly. It's a buffet thing. We have an embarrassment of riches. I'm almost positive there are enough seats